We go back now to terrorism and national security, and we're joined by Bob Cesca. Bob, welcome back to the Young Turks, a place that you've been many times before.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. You know, I'm thinking maybe I should just bail out. I want to be on tomorrow's show with Wes Clark.
Well, it's Wes Clark Jr., and I hope you still want to be on, but it's...
yeah, of course.
Right, yeah, was a son of a general. Isn't that what it is?
Yeah, I mean, anything's better than Richard.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kidding.
After all our years in the trenches together, you could say that.
That's right.
Bob, we've covered terrorism in this hour and talking about former Vice President Cheney, and then, of course, John Brennan responding to what he had to say on all of the talk shows yesterday, how the whole idea of terrorism is being fought very vigorously by this White House, despite what the former Vice President has to say, and I know you have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, you know, I'm wondering if, the Cheney people have naked pictures of all of the Bush people. I mean, the Bush people are just terrified of saying anything to the effect, well, I mean, Hayden was on, and of course, John Brennan transcends a bunch of the administrations.
Yeah.
They're just clearly afraid of Cheney and whoever surrounds Cheney. I'm wondering what they've got on him.
Well, do we... In all seriousness, this is also something Richard and I were talking about before. Do we have to pay attention to Dick Cheney? I mean, who is it? Does the White House have to respond? Or is he just somebody out there like everybody else talking about, partisan politics?
My point, Bob, was that here's a guy with 13% favorability ratings, and there are communicable diseases that have better numbers than Dick Cheney. Does the White House really need to stoop to respond to this guy? And we had a little back and forth about that. What are your thoughts?
Insofar as Cheney keeps getting presented in the traditional press, I don't think the White House has any choice but to respond. Whenever Cheney says something, he says it through the Politico. Politico link trolls to Drudge. Drudge is all over the place. Then you've got, it infiltrating the 24-hour cable news cycle. And then and there's another aspect to this that's kind of aggravating, but at the same time it's really silly and transparent. And that is that in a lot of ways, Cheney and Karl Rove are playing into the right-wingosphere, playing into wingnuttia by saying things that are deliberately inflammatory to liberals, and specifically, what they're doing is they're playing this sort of childish payback game, where what they're doing is they're just recycling attacks on George W. Bush from the previous 8 years, and turning them around onto the Obama administration. Say, see how you like it.
Yeah.
We're going to say Obama is inarticulate and takes too many vacations.
Right. I mean, that's the game, and they're playing, but they're very provocative. That's the way they play their game, is to be provocative in this way. And the only way you stop people, I would submit, from succeeding at provocativity, and I'm not going to stand by that word, is to not be provoked, is to not respond, is to let them go away. Because I don't think Dick Cheney would still be in the news cycle were it not for the fact that so many people are mentioning his name. I'm doing it right now, that we're talking about it, we're talking about his comments. I think it would stay, as Richard said, in that 13% zone.
Well, if he was some obscure, syndicated right-wing talk show host, and I'm not talking about Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh or even Sean Hannity, I'm talking about
someone we've
guys
never
like
heard
Mike
of.
Gallagher, or Bill Cunningham. If they were saying something deliberately inflammatory, it'd be a lot easier to ignore, but because it's the former vice president, or it's the former, in the case of Karl Rove, the former political advisor, it's almost impossible to ignore that.
Yeah,
I wish they would, but I think there's a certain it's almost good to kind of put it out there because it makes them look really, really bad. The only problem with that is that news organizations, and I use that term loosely in the case of Politico, they have an obligation to say, you know what, here's this thing that Cheney is saying about trying the underpants bomber in the American judicial system and the American court system. this is absolutely wrong, and here's why. And it took Mike Allen maybe 24, 48 hours, something like that, after publishing verbatim Cheney's statement, to actually come out and say something that resembled some kind of watchdogging or some sort of reporting that completely debunked what Cheney had to say. And that's irresponsible. I think if you're going to present this stuff, and I think it's the same with Rush Limbaugh or Glenn Beck or any of these guys, I think it's important to expose it. It's important to have it out there. Media Matters, I think, does a great service by presenting all of this stuff and saying, and here's why it's wrong. Yeah. I think to that same degree, I think you put Cheney's statement out there, and then you go through A through Z of exactly why he's wrong. And with this particular statement, that's not a difficult task.
No, I thought you did a great job on that, Bob. And I think that one of the things that, from a strictly political point of view, besides exposing the truth, I think one of the few but very compelling arguments I can give for writing about what Dick Cheney or Karl Rove have to say is as a form of political jujitsu, to say that if there's any way to frame what they're saying so that it costs them and their point of view public support, that's so much the better. That if we can say, look, this is a guy who's using a double standard, and the way he's doing it is actually hurting the bipartisan interests of the American public, so much the better. And I guess, the risk is that that's what they tried to do. They tried to say, well, it's un-American to criticize the president, so it's a thin line to walk, but if there's a way to do it, that's a good angle. Don't you think?
I really was glad to see John Brennan out there, Michael Hayden, even shirt off, kind of contradicting what Cheney had to say. And that was a little refreshing, because I think that does add that sort of bipartisan view of his remarks. And but I think there needs to be a grounding in some sort of objective reality. And I see very few journalists or news outlets who actually present an objective reality to things like Cheney's statements. For example, I get email from wingnut bloggers and readers and commenters and things like that. There's one guy trying to blame the fact that the shoe bomber was tried in the American courts because of the precedent that Bill Clinton established. Yeah. I said, what the hell is that? That makes no sense whatsoever. The shoe bomber was tried by the Bush administration, the American court system, because of Bill Clinton, somehow, years later? I mean, there's no...
Well, we're dealing with people who use the rhetoric of personal responsibility, but don't actually take personal responsibility on behalf of themselves or the people they support. It's always somebody else's fault.
They're free to blame anybody.
Right.
They're absolutely free to blame anybody, and no matter where, whoever they supported and whatever policies they embrace, it doesn't matter, because when something goes wrong, it's always somebody else's fault.
That's right. I got another email in which some wingnut had the audacity to say, the reason the Bush administration released the Yemeni detainees from Gitmo in 2007, pressure from the Democratic Congress.
Right, because we know how much they submitted to pressure from the Democratic Congress.
Well, I mean,
that's right.
Yemen has their finger on the pulse of Congress. They don't act without congressional authority. It's like the War Powers Act. It's the same thing in Yemen. They look at our Congress. Talking about the shoe bomber, you have to think that he had a ridiculous name, but then along came the underpants bomber.
Right.
To be known as the underpants bomber has just got to be the worst.
And it cannot have felt good either.
No, certainly. I don't think he was trying to feel good, though.
I don't think it was a feel-good exercise.
It wasn't a feel-good exercise, but man, to be known as the underpants bomber.
Thank God nobody was hurt.
I think if a guy who had to stash some sort of explosive gear in his underpants and actually made it onto an airplane, and the whole thing failed, and then his underpants are presented like a mugshot all over the world. If that's the kind of terrorists that are getting through the dragnet I think we're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I think maybe you've got something there. Well, Bob Cesca, thanks so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Always fun to have you. And really, the bottom line here is it's also interesting to read what you're writing. Go to thehuffingtonpost.com, look up Bob Cesca's work, and then tune in because he'll probably be on the show pretty soon.